So, dear colleagues, my name is Jürgen Renn from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and I'm very happy to welcome here all of you, not just on behalf of the Max Planck Institute, but this is the beginning of a new lecture series, the Anthropocene lecture series, and it's a joint endeavor of the Max Planck Institute, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and it's a particular pleasure that representatives of all of these institutions are here with us. They have all collaborated in making this series possible. Particular thanks to Christoph Rosol, Franz Maulshagen, Helge Wendt, many people who have collaborated. Julia Rispoli, of course, have collaborated in making this possible. The Anthropocene is a joint research interest of all of these institutions. Many of you will remember that jointly with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, we undertook the organization of the large Anthropocene campuses. The third campus is now well underway, taking place in Philadelphia. It has made the Anthropocene a subject of broad discussions here in the Berlin area and well beyond. The Anthropocene is also a research topic at the various participating institutions. Some of the results are here on this table if you want to look at them. And the purpose of this Anthropocene lecture series is to invite prominent voices to debate and to further accentuate the concepts and its implications for the humanities and for history and history of science and history of knowledge in particular. And we think this is necessary in view of the dramatic and destabilizing changes we are currently witnessing. And we also think that with all the drama that is behind the Anthropocene concept, it's also an opportunity for rethinking basic concepts of our professional endeavors of the history and of the history of science in particular. So the Anthropocene concept has been analytically very fertile, I think personally, for our investigations. And therefore it's a particular pleasure to welcome one of the pioneers of this rethinking of history in view of the Anthropocene, Professor John McNeill. Welcome, we're very happy to have you here. He is an environmental historian, author, and professor at Georgetown University, has been at Georgetown University since 1985. He has been...
Since the Miocene.
Since the Miocene. That's a long time indeed, so we are thinking in geological timescales. He has also been an American, a president of the American Society for Environmental History. That was still in the, no, that was already in the Anthropocene. It depends on how you count it. Yeah, not. And he is best known for authoring books that have been widely read also outside the profession of historians. Something New Under the Sun, An Environmental History of the 20th Century World, appeared in 2001, just shortly after the century closed. You already wrapped it up. Then a book that I personally read with the greatest pleasure and made fruitful use of together in my work with Helge Wendt, The Human Web, A Bird's Eye View of World History, which you co-authored with your father, Professor William McNeill, and Rethinking Environmental History, World Systems History and Global Environmental Change from 2007, which you co-edited. And your newest book, which we have been started to read in our little Anthropocene working group, is The Great Acceleration, An Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945. And I have mentioned our little Anthropocene working group. You are a member of the important big Anthropocene working group, one of the 38 members of this group, which is an international body installed by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And this group is tasked with the proposal of preparing a formal recognition of the Anthropocene as a definitive unit of the geological timescale. And it's very remarkable that this group has such an international composition. And we are looking forward also to hear a little bit more about the current discussions in these groups and also the politics surrounding it. And we, of course, I repeat it once more, interested particularly in the consequences all of these discussions have for studying the history of science and the history of knowledge. And with this somewhat long introduction, Professor Neil, I leave the floor to you, and we're all very excited to have you here and listen to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for your kind words. It is gratifying to be here, to be invited to Berlin, which has become the world center of Anthropocene studies, and particularly to inaugurate this lecture series. I hope that things go well enough today that the lecture series will not be canceled immediately afterwards. But before I begin, it is true, as Jürgen Renn said, that I co-authored a book with my father. Perhaps the most useful thing I can do today is to say that if any of you are ever considering co-authoring a book with a close relative of yours, talk to me first. I can save you some family counseling fees, perhaps. So this is a talk that I've never given before, which is why I'm holding my wristwatch in my hand. I won't be able to pace it and time it perfectly, but I'll try to bring it in under 45 minutes so that Mark Lawrence doesn't miss his train, and those of you who have dinner engagements won't be tempted to stampede for the door before I finish. This is what I intend to do this evening, and with luck, I'll keep to that order. The first thing I need to do is explain what I mean by the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, because as you well know, it means very different things to different people. Che Guevara, a generation ago, asked for 1 to 100 Vietnams. There are 1 to 100 Anthropocenes now. They're multiplying rapidly. There are, for example, older and newer Anthropocenes, as most of you are well aware. And I note a couple of the more prominent ones. Bill Ruderman's arguments for an Anthropocene that began 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Really the original formulation of Paul Crutzen, with a date sometimes given as 1784, sometimes as 1800, at any rate intended to correspond with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and intensive fossil fuel use. I wrote here, and mine too, in 2007, and I'm going to explain a little bit what I used to think and what I think now. Thirdly, the AWG, that's the Anthropocene Working Groups, the majority of that body thinks that an Anthropocene, a newer Anthropocene, is a more sensible position to take. So that's the 1945 to 1950 birthday for the Anthropocene. And I have changed my mind about these matters, which is why I take refuge in this quotation from the American transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. The quotation is also sometimes attributed to Karl Marx. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Well, I have not been consistent. I may have been foolish, but I was inconsistently foolish rather than adopting a foolish consistency. In some disciplines, it's possible to be a bit more flexible about chronology and periodization, and I'll say a fair bit about this later on. But in stratigraphy, it's not easy to be flexible and fuzzy. For stratigraphers, when one interval of time ends, another one begins, and there's no partial Pleistocene. There's no semi-Pleistocene. It begins, it ends. These are sharp boundaries for stratigraphy. So for stratigraphers, the notion that the Anthropocene might be dated to 1800 or might be dated to 1950, even though it's a tiny interval of time, it seems to make a difference. And I will return to that question in a moment. In addition to early and late, or old and new Anthropocenes, there are also good and bad Anthropocenes. This is Stuart Brand, who's one of a tribe of people sometimes referred to as eco-modernists, who seem to look forward to an Anthropocene that will feature careful management for sustainability. That's a version of the good Anthropocene, in which human impact is not chaotic, not full of unintended consequences, but instead is rational and has only those consequences that planetary managers intend. You can tell by my choice of words that I'm a bit skeptical of all this. I'm more in the bad Anthropocene camp, by which I mean I would anticipate that the scale of human impact on the global environment is likelier to lead to an unruly planet with more unpredictable features and more extremes in climate, for example. These debates between good and bad Anthropocene are in some respects reminiscent of earlier debates a generation ago about human impact on the environment, particularly with respect to scarcity of economically important materials. But there are different inflections in the current debate. So, to specify my own positions a little bit, when I first started thinking about these things, I didn't use the term Anthropocene. I was not clever enough to come up with a new word that would instantly indicate the importance of the ongoing scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change. But I was thinking about these things 20 years ago, and I argued that the 20th century as a whole was something new in the relationship between humankind and planet Earth, and indeed it was something new in the history of life on Earth and the history of the Earth. Beyond that, I actually said that it was the post-1950 period that was most distinctive. And in saying this, I really should have invented the term Anthropocene, but I was too dumb and didn't think of it. When I was thinking in these terms, I was influenced, I believe, I'm looking back on this and trying to remember what I was influenced by, partly by Christian Pfister's arguments, the Swiss historian of climate, argument about the significance of the 1950s in Switzerland and in Europe. And to some extent, he argued beyond, but he was mainly focused on Switzerland in Europe. More fundamentally, I think I was influenced simply by the curves of energy use and population growth, some of which I'll show you in a moment. And I was, I'm sure of this much, powerfully influenced by a paragraph in a book written by Carlo Cipolla, the Italian historian of technology, among other things. He's a very versatile historian. He has a passage in this tiny little book, which is only 100 pages long, a passage in which he explains that if the contemporary rate of human population growth in the 1950s and early 60s, this book was published in 1962, if that contemporary rate of population growth continued for just a few more centuries, It had only been going on for a decade or so at that point. For a few more centuries, the Earth would be encased in a mass of human flesh expanding with a radial velocity greater than the speed of light. Now, I knew that wasn't going to happen. But it was a spectacular image of the implications of compound growth, exponential growth. And that helped me to think about how weird it was that for a while human population was growing by 2% or 2.1% per annum, and energy use was growing much faster than that. So this is, I think, what convinced me that the post-1950 period was indeed something bizarre, anomalous, unprecedented, and radically unsustainable. A few years later, not far from here, in Dahlem, I met Paul Crutzen for the first time. And together with Will Steffen, Paul Crutzen and I authored an article which I think is called Stages, the subtitle is Stages of the Anthropocene. The title is something like, Are Humans Now Overwhelming the Planet, or some anodyne phrase like that. At any rate, in this article, the argument was different. The argument was that the Anthropocene really began in 1800, and that post-1945 is a second stage in the Anthropocene. The sort of thing that stratigraphers don't tolerate is stages, or they don't easily tolerate, stages of the Anthropocene. And at the time, it wasn't exactly the argument that I wanted to make, but it was the argument that I agreed to, because when you co-author a paper with a Nobel Prize winner, you don't actually get the final say. At least I don't get the final say. Maybe some of you can do better. So my Anthropocene now, the way I think about it, is a little bit like the way I thought about it when I wrote Something New Under the Sun, and not quite the way I thought about it 10 years ago in Dahlem. And it is an Anthropocene that is defined by two main things. One, the fundamental biogeochemical cycles of the planet now being strongly influenced by human activity. So this is the nitrogen cycle. That, to me, is something that marks off the post-1950 period from all prior history. Second thing is this basket of variables. These are put together by Will Steffen and the International Biosphere Program team, and I'll show you another slide in just a moment that makes this a little bit more comprehensible. But this is 1950 right here, and everything is skyrocketing as of the middle of the 20th century. And many of these things are sort of outside the envelope of the Holocene range of variability. The stratigraphers with whom I've been rubbing shoulders for a few years are much less interested than I am in why these things are happening. For my money, the two big issues are energy use and global population. There are other things going on, but for me, a person who's interested in causation, those are things that also indicate that we're in a new interval of geological time. And I want to emphasize that my Anthropocene has nothing to do with the advent of human impact on the Earth. Many times I find myself in discussion with people who either take a different view of this or, less charitably put, misunderstand the concept of the Anthropocene and want to make it synonymous with human impact on the biosphere or human impact on the Earth, which of course goes way back. And one of my neighbors, Earl Ellis, sometimes likes to argue that the mass extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene should be understood as the beginning of the Anthropocene. So my view is fundamentally different from that. And there are people who think that the harnessing of fire, whenever that happened, 1 million years ago perhaps, should be recognized as the beginning of the Anthropocene. I think it loses meaning when understood in those terms. So here are some of the basket of variables that Will Steffen and his colleagues assembled, which are part of the reason that I choose the Anthropocene that I choose. And so many of them, of course, they were cherry-picked and selected precisely for this purpose. So many of them demonstrate the significance of the middle of the 20th century. And I say they were cherry-picked for this purpose, that is true, but they're also decidedly non-trivial indicators of trends in the Earth system and the human system or social system. So that is the Anthropocene. This got scrunched a little bit. That is the Anthropocene to me. And I wanted to explain how I got to that one and what its characteristics are before getting into my anthropological narrative of life among the stratigraphers. So, most of you are probably aware of what the Anthropocene Working Group is and the various bodies that it reports to. There's a sort of nested hierarchy of organs that each have sovereignty over whether or not changes should be made in the system by which geologists periodize the history of the Earth. But a little bit about the AWG. First, who is it? It's mostly British geologists. Here are a number of them. This was a gathering, I think this is the Norway, Oslo gathering, the most recent one. It is, as Jürgen said, now 38 people, but it's been growing since it was created 8-9 years ago. Its purpose is narrowly defined to make a recommendation as to whether there is a geological basis, a stratigraphic basis for a new interval of geological time, the Anthropocene, and if so, what is that geological and stratigraphic basis? And that is all that the AWG is authorized to do. What it actually does is debate and discuss this issue, lots of related issues, including some tangentially related issues, and write a paper every 2 months or so, which has been great for me because now my dean and provost think that I'm a worthwhile citizen because my name is on papers that appear in prestigious science journals. Wonderful for me, even if I have very modest input into these papers. So that's what the AWG does. It does its work mostly as an email group. It has met in person 4 times, briefly, every time in Europe, every time during my semester. So I've never attended any of those meetings in person. But I have taken a moderately active role in the email discussions, which are the heart and soul, 90% of the AWG's work. It is, I think it has a core membership that interacts more tightly, and these are British geologists themselves who see one another regularly because they all live in Britain. The AWG in the fall of 2016 made a recommendation up the chain of command, so to speak, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, to the International Union of Geological Sciences at its Cape Town meeting. I think it was October of 16. And recommended that, yes, the Anthropocene should be considered seriously, and a post-1945 Anthropocene is the best Anthropocene. The response was, okay, give us more data. We're not ready to make a decision. And that means that the Anthropocene Working Group now is embarked on a quest for a specific kind of data, a golden spike. That is something in the earth rock itself or the ice that serves as the marker between one interval and the next of geological time. And that is, since October of 16, the main activity of the AWG. And as a result, I'm a bit less involved because I have, that's a technical question, and I have no training in stratigraphy, so I have less to say about the current activities of the AWG than I did for the previous few years. I have been a member only since 2013. So the AWG was up and running for a few years before a minor accident of history took place, which accounts for my membership of the AWG. The chair, Jan Zalasewicz or Zalasevich, I met him at a conference in Chicago in 2013. He asked me to become a member. I was skeptical. He assured me there wouldn't be much work involved, and the fact that I was not a geologist would not be held against me. So I said yes, and since then I have been embarked on this interesting anthropological adventure, interacting on a weekly basis, more or less, with stratigraphers. And in a moment, I'll explain some of the curiosities that result from that. My own contributions have been to work on these papers, trying to prevent the odd historical error, maybe get some of the passive voice out of their writing, but the fundamental decisions I have had no input on. That is, what should we write a paper on next, for example? Eccentricities of the AWG. From the point of stratigraphers, there are two main curiosities about the AWG. The first one is that it has lots of people who are neither stratigraphers nor paleontologists on it. That is unusual for a working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. It might be unique, I'm not sure. It's at the very least very unusual. The second curiosity from the stratigrapher's point of view is that its whole arc of work is backwards from a normal working group. A normal working group results from years and years of study of rock, which generates a new idea about how the past should be sliced up into intervals of time. This one is the reverse of that, an idea that came from outside the community of stratigraphers, and as you all know, it's mainly associated with Paul Crutzen, although he does not claim to be the originator of the term or concept. Came from outside the community of stratigraphers. The idea came first, and it has led to what the AWG is most energetically doing now, which is searching the world's rock and ice for suitable golden spikes to mark the advent of the Anthropocene. So it looks weird to many people in the stratigraphy community. From the perspective of a historian, it also looks weird, but for entirely different reasons. The first of which is it exists. So my tribe, historians, we argue about periodization all the time, but we never make formal recommendations about it. We never vote on it. We don't have a chain of command that claims sovereignty over how periods of the past should be recognized. Anybody can do anything they like. We could have the Franz Malshagen period in the history of Berlin. I could claim that that exists, and nobody would. They might not pay attention, they might not take this up, they might not agree with me, but I can do it. Nobody can stop me. Maybe I'll do this.
Or the Parker minimum.
Or the Parker minimum. So historians are anarchic in the schemes of periodization, and different parts of the world have different schemes. So the very fact that stratigraphers are trying to formally decide whether the Anthropocene exists or not is weird. A second thing that's weird from a historian's perspective, at least to me, I'm not sure everybody would see this the same way, is this, the emphasis on durability in those golden spikes. So one of the things that we've discussed is whether the residue of plastics, which is all over the place, and is the great preponderance of it is post-1945, whether this could serve as a suitable golden spike, marking off the Holocene from the Anthropocene. But the question has arisen, what is the preservation potential of plastics? Will they be there in 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years? To me, this is really weird. Why does it matter that plastics might not be there in 1,000,000 years or 100,000 years? To me, we're not going to be here in 1,000,000 years. If there are geologists in 1,000,000 years, they aren't going to think the way geologists think now. So trying to find a golden spike that is going to be recognizable and meet the criteria of stratigraphy today and is going to be there in 1,000,000 years seems illogical to me. But it's not, from the point of view of many of the stratigraphers, all the other golden spikes, all the other markers have been there for millions of years, or in one case for 11,700 years. And so honoring that tradition makes sense to stratigraphers. To me, it seems irrational and nonsensical. Stratigraphers also emphasize that they want synchronicity and, if this is a word, globality in the golden spikes. So a new interval of time, it should ideally be observable all over the world, or at least many points in the world, at the same time. So for historians, this also seems peculiar. We don't care if a certain period began sooner in one place or another, or if, let's say, the interwar period was shorter in Germany than it was in the United States. That's okay. But it's not okay for stratigraphers. They want a synchronous marker. Two other things that seem a bit strange to me about the business of the AWG is that it is essentially a hobby. All the AWG members are working in time that they steal from their routine responsibilities. That's true of me, it's true of all of them. It's much more onerous for most of the others who do a lot more work than I do. And none of them have any funding for this. So it's all a sideline, a hobby. And equally unstructured is the recruitment of new members. It's kind of mysterious. I only know how I joined, and I know a couple of people who wanted to join, and weren't admitted to the club. I don't know why. Why certain people are in and other people are not in is it's mysterious to me. And there's no formal process that I'm aware of. I think it's the core group in Britain who discuss and decide, but I don't even know that for sure. So there are certain wildly informal aspects to the AWG which contrast with the formal ambition of stratigraphy of defining rigorously a new interval of geological time. And the last curiosity about it seems to me that the AWG and the geology profession at large is not in much of a hurry to sort this out. It took a long time to finalize the definition of the Holocene and the golden spikes. There's more than one of the Holocene. And it could be, who knows, that we'll all be long dead before the final decision is rendered on the Anthropocene. Now, a few last words, because I haven't managed the time very well, about what all this might mean from the point of view of my home discipline, history, and what it might mean for the whole notion of disciplines. So, historians, oh dear, this got a little bit mucked up in translation from PC to Mac. Sorry about that. Historians, like a lot of scholars in the humanities and social sciences, are trying hard to make use of the Anthropocene concept. To me, it's remarkable how fast it has taken hold. This is a chart of the number of articles with the word Anthropocene in the title, and it's kind of like those curves I showed a moment ago, except this is not 1950, it's 2010, after which it seems to be an Anthropocenic explosion in scientific, social scientific, and humanities literature. That only goes to 2015. If I could have it through 2017, it would continue this steep exponential rise. So that seems to me remarkable, and historians are a small part of that, but many are eagerly embracing the concept. I have Darwin here because I couldn't think of any concept that has taken hold across the intellectual landscape like the Anthropocene as successfully since Darwin's ideas about evolution. No doubt I'm overlooking something, but I haven't figured it out, whatever it is. So for historians, the Anthropocene, I think, has some utility, helping us to put the last two human generations into perspective as wildly anomalous and bizarre time in human history, in environmental history, as well as in the history of the Earth and life on Earth. I think it helps us, historians, engage with the deeper past, which has been not a very popular undertaking among historians. But I think that's beginning to shift, and the concept of the Anthropocene is part of the reason. I also think, and you can't read it here because I've inadvertently obliterated it with that chart, that the Anthropocene concept also helps historians think about what their work might mean for the future. Historians usually don't worry about that, and certainly aren't very good at trying to envision the future. But just as the Anthropocene concept invites us to think about the deeper past, I think it also invites us to think about what our work might mean for the future in ways that, as a profession, we have rarely done. Is there anything that historians can do to help crystallize the concept of the Anthropocene? The short answer, in my opinion, is not much that I can think of. Maybe you can think of other things. So to date, I think the input of historians has made matters less clear, has made the concept more fuzzy, introduced more uncertainty about what we should understand by the term Anthropocene. But it is possible that historians will add a useful dimension to these debates by virtue of our obsession with causation. The stratigraphers with whom I deal do not normally worry very much about why a certain fossil is present before and absent afterwards. The fact that it is so is important for defining the strata, for defining one interval of geological time for another. But why that happened, paleontologists might be interested in it, but the stratigraphers typically much, much less so. Historians are consumed with notions of causation, and so that might be a consistent contribution that we will make to these debates. And also, another potential contribution, one that the anthropologists have been making and historians less so, but should be making more, is the stratigraphers and geologists need reminders of this frequently, that the Earth as a social system is not homogeneous, that the Anthropocene is experienced, is understood, has meaning that is different in one society from the next, and within societies from one community to the next. And historians can remind and remind and remind, as anthropologists are doing, everyone about the importance of that. Now, I've got some rival views about causation here, and I don't mean to gloss over this and give the impression that historians agree about how to understand causation in history. Far from it. But I think that historians are good at thinking about it, recognizing the nuances and challenges within it, and can conceivably add that to the debates. Lastly, in this vein, what challenges does the Anthropocene concept pose for historians? The two main challenges as I see it. One of them is that one of the justifications we have always offered for our work, why people should pay attention to history, may be undermined by the Anthropocene. So ever since Thucydides, historians, at least some historians, have argued that there is utility in history and the study of history and educating people in history because the future in some ways must resemble the past. That's what Thucydides claimed in the introduction to his history. But if it is the case that the Anthropocene is something entirely new and different, that it is different enough from what came before, does that not undermine this argument that historians have made for 2,400 years about the utility of what they do? I would say it probably does undermine that argument. Another challenge for historians, I suspect, is that if we are to take the Anthropocene seriously, we need to take a variety of forms of evidence about the past seriously that we are not trained and educated to do. So we train and educate ourselves to deal with texts, learn languages, learn paleography, but we may need to learn other kinds of things altogether. This is, as most of you recognize, a pollen diagram. This is from a lake in Catalonia, what as of this morning was still Spain. And this is kind of interesting. This shows, this is, you can't read this, I'm afraid, but this is pasture land here. These are the medieval centuries. fairly stable land use, emphasizing pasture land, a spike here in coniferous forests. That's in the 17th century. I think that's the 17th century crisis manifesting itself in land use in northwestern Catalonia. And then here in the 18th and 19th century, a big, huge spike in hemp. This is cultivated hemp, and it's not being used for marijuana, it's being used to make rope. This is evidence of the shipbuilding industry's boom in Barcelona and adjacent ports in the 18th and 19th century. So there are ways to read a pollen diagram as human history, which I think might be a skill that we should be trying to equip ourselves and teach younger historians. Equally, and more difficult, I would say, is interpreting genomic evidence. This is the cost of genomic research per some unit. I can't remember what unit. Diving around 2010 and diving again around 2015. So things that were impossibly expensive have now become cheap, and human history, as revealed through genomic analysis, is becoming practical in a way that it never was before. And if we're going to unite long time horizons with the more conventional study of history, we will find it necessary, I think, to grapple with new kinds of evidence, to create a consilient history. I'm stealing that word from the biologist E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book about the importance of bringing all sorts of sciences together. He called it consilience. So, consilient history would not be easy. Either single individuals would have to master a lot of tools, some of which are difficult, or else would have to work together in teams. Both of these are difficult. But it could be worse than that. It could be that even consilient history isn't satisfactory for trying to come to grips with the Anthropocene. This is Aristotle, and I'm blaming him for the existence of separate disciplines. It could be that the whole notion of having different disciplines is a manifestation of Holocene thinking and prevents us from seeing things more clearly in the Anthropocene. It could be that the various disciplines have served their purpose. They, for decades or centuries, shone a bright beam of light on certain subjects, but between those beams of light there was darkness. And so maybe they've served their purpose and we need to abolish the disciplines. I don't think so. Or at least it's too frightening for me to contemplate. So here is the finale, the unspooling of the geological time chart, and the positions that I think I am most comfortable with. So, as you know, I like a post-1945 Anthropocene, although I like to believe I'm open to persuasion, and if there are good arguments for earlier or even later Anthropocenes, or no Anthropocene at all, I hope I would be persuaded by satisfactory evidence. I am, and this may just be my personality, I'm worried more about an unruly Anthropocene, and I am not at all confident in the human capacity to manage the planet, and so I do not anticipate a good Anthropocene. Geologists are already wrestling with the implications of all this. Historians have only just begun to wrestle. But I think because we do not set rules the way the stratigraphers do about periodization, that historians are going to be arguing about this even longer than the stratigraphers and geologists, who will one day decide either that there is or isn't an Anthropocene. Historians will never agree upon that. But I think we're just getting started trying to use the concept and debate its utility. And lastly, I think that it is time that we historians abandon the text fetish and embrace the multiple lines of evidence, most of them coming out of the natural sciences, that will allow a more consilient history appropriate to the Anthropocene. But I'm not ready to go so far as some people are, maybe people who organize Max Planck Institutes, go so far as to abandon the disciplines altogether. Thank you very much for your patience, and I hope we have a few minutes for Q&A before people need to run off.
John, thank you very much for this inside view of the Anthropocene. You have touched upon many of the subjects that are of interest to our group. You have given us what I would call really a workshop talk. You have really involved us into the practices of the Anthropocene and have given us some of the inside perspectives, and I'm very grateful for this. You are in a privileged position, and you shared this position with us. And I'm particularly grateful also for the historiographical issues that you unfolded in the end. But I do want to challenge you a little bit. You started out as emphasizing the role of inconsistency. You started to praise the many Anthropocene possibilities. And towards the end of your talk, you tried to be conciliant and to have a more integrative and a consistent version of the Anthropocene. And I want to challenge you, probing how inconsistent are you really, or do you dare to be? And I was surprised a little bit that you changed your position, agreeing with the stratigrapher's perspective on a post-1945 Anthropocene, although as you emphasized yourself, the perspective of history is quite different, and the practices of history are quite different from those of stratigraphy. Stratigraphers, as you pointed out, need to have clearly demarcated time periods. There's no room for overlap. They have their hierarchy, and you emphasized several times that historians have different practices, have not the same kind of chain of command. And I think also very different questions. Again, I'm taking up what you said yourself. Stratigraphers, to put it shortly, are interested in specific effects that have certain qualities, durable qualities, global qualities that they can measure and put through their command chain. Historians are interested in causes. And there is no reason why questions for effects should have the same kind of answers than questions for causes. So in the discussions that we have been having, we have, and I think somebody like Jeremy Davies, for instance, has very soberly acknowledged, yes, let's all use the stratigraphic Anthropocene as our common starting point. Let's not lose sight in all of this multitude of this essential point of reference. But on the other hand, as historians, political scientists, we should be free asking about the causes. And I can see, quite frankly, no reason why the Anthropocene from a historical perspective should focus on things after 1945 from a causal point of view, because many of these exponential graphs that you have been showing, going back to Will Steffen and his collaborators, have a dynamics, are demonstrating a dynamics that have its roots much earlier. And we as historians always have a tendency of going back as far as possible into time and unfolding this dynamic. So I would like to encourage you to be more inconsistent than you have been trying to do, and not be so conciliant with the stratigraphers.
So it was said of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, that he agreed with whoever spoke to him last. And I may be guilty of the same thing, in that, having been interacting with stratigraphers, at least by email, and very occasionally in person for the last several years, I have adopted the stratigrapher's Anthropocene. But in my defense, I will say two things. First of all, if the Anthropocene concept is to be useful, we do need some kind of agreement about what it means. If it means 400 different things, it's useless. And if we are defining it as an interval in geological time, then I feel that the geologists and the stratigraphers get the loudest voice in what the Anthropocene is. Point number one. Point number two is, 20 years ago, when I was thinking about this book that became something new under the sun, I was driven to approximately the same conclusions that the stratigraphers are also driving towards, for completely different reasons. I didn't know anything about stratigraphy at that point. I'm not even sure if I'd ever encountered the word. But for different reasons, energy history, population history, the history of fisheries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I was driven towards the same conclusion, that the middle of the 20th century is such an inflection point that it should be understood as, well, something new under the sun. All of which is not to say that there aren't deeper roots to every single component, and that the causes may lie deep in the past. In some respects, the causes lie millions of years ago in the evolution of the brains of hominins and then Homo sapiens. Without the kind of brains we've got, we wouldn't have an Anthropocene. There are deep taproots that go back way, 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 way back, even before periods of time that historians concern themselves with. I do not deny that. And I do not deny that there's population growth was climbing in its rate in the 18th century. I do not deny that many things that contribute to the Anthropocene that can be understood as helping to cause the Anthropocene have deep, 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 deep roots. But I think from a historical point of view, as well as from a stratigraphical point of view, there is compelling reason to think that the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century are indeed radically different. Now, let me say one last thing about this. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I worry about this position that I've taken, because it happens to correspond approximately with my own lifetime. And so I wonder, I was born in 1954, I wonder whether this is all, this position I'm taking is self-referential, that I'm consumed with changes in my own time. And I think detected that in some other historians who claim that their own time is special, radically different from all that has come before. So I worry a little bit sometimes in the wee hours of the night, but not enough to change my mind about that. Not yet.
Thank you very much, John. Professor Motzkin wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
I must say I'm very sympathetic to your last. Comment, because, you know, of course, we're all convinced by all the statistics and all the material that people have dredged up about why this era is completely different. And nonetheless, I have some hesitations in my lifetime about our optical illusions. And I'll describe three of these optical illusions. One is, man is the center of the process of history, or the process of evolution, or the process of what's going on Earth. So of course, if man is the center, then you're always oriented to the next calamity, which is what you're oriented to, and I see that as problematic. The second is, and you must have had this too, that's what you mean by self-referentiality, that we all grew up with texts distinguishing the traditional from the modern. And how many papers did we read, and we were grading them, that there were two periods. One is all of human history until 50 or 70 or 80 years ago, and the big change that occurred, and it could have occurred in 100 different fields. And that you worry about whether this big change is not some kind of moving target. I remember the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, democracy, on and on and on. And the third is what I'd call the illusion of the meaning of it all. The meaning of it all is this. I recently read a book about English genetics. And this geneticist was arguing that the English, in fact, are not Norman, they're not Anglo-Saxon, they're not Celtic, but that his studies have shown that they're all Basques. Now that's a very interesting comment, and then I thought, what is the meaning of that? Why should anybody care about the fact that they in fact are Basques when all of human history has been vague Celtic memories, some Anglo-Saxon, lots of Norman in the historical tale, so that the historical tale and the natural condition actually diverge. So those are 3 points where I'm completely convinced by everything you say, yet I sometimes feel uneasy.
Welcome to the club. So I feel particularly uneasy with respect to the last point on 2 counts. I have witnessed a geneticist at an international conference who said she could tell the difference between, looking at 5th century AD skeletal tissue, she could tell the difference between a German and a Frenchman in the genetic profiles in the 5th century. And what was a German in the 5th century? What was a French person in the 5th century? It had vague overtones that have been, unfortunately, well, here in Berlin, vague overtones of National Socialist rhetoric. She had no idea what she sounded like to a historian. Uneasiness number 1, but this is an argument for the involvement in historians in this broader project of research into the past, both the human past and the non-human past altogether. The second piece of uneasiness about this is that for decades I had been told by my parents and grandparents that I was ultimately Irish. My McNeills come from an island off the west coast of Scotland that was uninhabited until the 10th century, when allegedly some losers in an Irish civil war colonized this island, and that's our ancestry. So I was Scottish, but of ultimately Irish descent. Well, somebody performed genetic tests on the entire living population of this one island, and it seems that they're all from Norway. They're all Vikings. So instead of being an underdog, a loser in an Irish civil war, my ancestry is actually, apparently, if this is to be believed, the ancestry of violent pillagers, maulers, rapists, and so forth. So I feel like I've been demoted as a result of this research. It is, I think, interesting to the kind of contributions that genetic research can make to human history. I showed a slide of that argues that there is a way to discern the proportion of African Americans that have Bantu-speaking ancestry. It's a little bit complicated because language and genetics do not go through time with any precision. There are also interesting projects being done about the migrations in 5th and 6th century Europe, illuminated by genetics. The texts are not all that eloquent about this whole process. So all that, I think, is fantastically interesting, even if fraught with danger and difficulty. Now, self-referentiality, tradition, and modern. Yeah, I try never to use the word tradition. As you say, students do. I share a little bit of unease about that. Not enough, again, to change my mind. And your first point was really interesting, but I've lost.
Human-centeredness.
Yeah, human-centeredness. Okay, as far as history is concerned, this does not bother me at all. I'm content with the notion that history is and should be human-centered, but you went on to mention, I think, evolution or life on Earth. Here, there's nothing human-centered about it, except insofar as, in recent time, humankind has edited the biome by hastening the extinction of some creatures and not others. In that sense, there is a certain human-centricness of evolution in a way that did not exist 5 million years ago or 50 million years ago. But by and large, I would say, no, life on Earth proceeds in many respects without much reference to human beings. So we need to recognize the limits of human impact, even if we emphasize how those limits are over time expanding. Sorry for that very lengthy answer, but there were 3 parts to that question.
Oh, it was a lengthy question. It merits a lengthy answer. That's quite okay. But we have more questions, if I saw correctly. No, there was a question by Gino Camprobi. Do you have a question also? What?
Thank you very much. This was very nice. My question is that you mentioned that stratigraphists want it global. They want the Anthropocene to be global, but when you were drawing conclusions for historians, you didn't comment much on what this means for us. And I think this is very interesting because a good chunk of the historical discipline has been moving towards, and particularly history of science, but also environmental history, from very local history to more transnational world history or global history. But at the same time, we as historians are very aware of, as you said, political differences in the global landscape, right? So we don't write global history as history of one single empire or anything like that. We write global history as history of competing empires and as history of people resisting empires as well. So heterogeneity is a very important component of our global picture. How do you factor that into our relationship to the Anthropocene?
So here's what I think is going on in the discipline of history, and it may look different to me than it does to you because of where I'm based as opposed to where you are based. So I agree that there is a movement over the last 15, 20 years, although it has deeper roots that go back at least to, well, they go back thousands of years, a movement towards embracing global history and its challenges. But I also think that there are powerful countervailing forces at work within the profession of history. And the most important of these, I think, is languages. The necessity of knowing the languages of the time and place in which you deal in order to be accepted as a legitimate historian. And you can't learn 8,000 languages. If you are a palynologist working with pollen diagrams, you can actually use the same techniques with only a little bit of changes in Catalonia and in China and in Argentina. The pollen you will find may be different, and you have to have graduate students who will go to the trouble of identifying the various grains, but the methods are exactly the same. So it's transportable in a way that the skills of a historian are not so easily transportable. So this is, I think, the most important of the countervailing forces, as well as the recognition that I think you were emphasizing, that human society is so heterogeneous and things are experienced so differently in different places, different societies, different levels of society. So I would say it is appropriate for historians to be careful about going global and to keep feet anchored firmly in specific grounds for methodological reasons, but also for purely intellectual reasons. The Anthropocene concept, I think, drags us in the direction of global perspectives, which is okay within limits, always coupled with a recognition that we have to recognize, we have to understand how different things are in different localities, and remind other disciplines that are not quite as committed to the principles of heterogeneity of these truths. And we have great allies in the anthropologists who are even more locally focused than historians are, by and large.
Thank you very much. We have one more question and we are in a lucky position to have a representative of one era that you mentioned, namely the Franz Maulshagen era. And we have Franz Maulshagen himself among us, who will now ask the question.
It turns out that the Anthropocene is actually the McNeill scene. Yeah. We could if you like. So, how is the relationship between those two eras anyway? John, thank you very much. I mean, I was particularly curious hearing about what you labeled challenges that the Anthropocene poses to the historian. And what we're doing as historians, and I particularly like this idea of, well, we have to rethink the deep time, and then the continent of Africa illustrated the other point, which was we have to consider all of that written evidence as historians. And one argument for that is obviously deep down in them the uneven written traditions, documented traditions that we have. But there was one thing that just crossed my mind once you closed the list. And it's something that makes me feel very uncomfortable, and I'd like to hear your position on it. And it's, what's the relationship between the Anthropocene and the problem of modernity? Or, say, the multiple modernities. I know it's a big cup of tea, or too big for a cup of tea. But it's something, that many people seem to, it seems we don't want to address this. But there are a lot of positions out there. I mean, Amita Ghosh, she sees the Anthropocene as the derangement of modernity, the idea of modernity. I think he's very much on the same side as okay, both of them aren't historians, and that's probably why historians avoid it. But I've also heard accusations that when you show the Steffen graphs, these 12 Earth system graphs and 12 societal, socioeconomic graphs, they all think, okay, that is stupid quantification combined with linearity in history. So you get, even if you present these graphs, I've experienced that myself, you're getting confronted with this idea of that were often, arguments that were often raised against modernity. Now we've left modernity as a concept, and the optimism that came with it in the 60s, 70s was still connected with it, at least at that time. We've left that behind us, and now the Anthropocene guys come, historians, and show us these linear graphs. How do you deal with that?
I don't. I said a moment ago that I try never to use the word tradition, and I could also have said that I try never to use the word modernity. And the reason for that is the extreme fuzziness of the term. It's what I hope the Anthropocene will not become. A term that 7 billion people use in 7 billion different ways and makes intellectual life more confusing rather than less confusing. So I deal with it by avoiding it and urging others either to abandon the term modernity or to be extremely precise in defining it before they use it. Last thing I'll say about this is that people who do like the concept of modernity are perfectly comfortable with the notion that it should begin at time X in one place and begin in time Y in another place, which, as you recognize, is inconsistent with the stratigrapher's ideal of the Anthropocene, not necessarily with the historian's concept of the Anthropocene. That's the best I can do, Franz.
Okay.
Intellectual life in the Franz Maleshagen period is sometimes
It's tough, we all know that.
unsatisfactory.
Perhaps a very naive comment to this debate. I don't really understand the big problems historians and all these guys have, because if the concept of the Anthropocene is something which is based on effects, and effects are the latest thing in something. First you have causes and then you have effects. So you see the effect later than the cause. And the second thing, it's a global concept. So it has to show up everywhere on the planet. So for me it's clear that then somebody who looks on that starts perhaps with 40 or 45 or 50s, although the reasons, for example, capitalist system or Christian kind of seeing Earth to work on, they are concepts from other disciplines and with another perspective, but it's very clear that they start earlier, that the effect of this and the global effect of this is later, is in the 50s. So for me this is perhaps a very naive view to get these sides together. So modernity, of course, is not in 70-50 all over the planet equitably distributed. We have modernity in some states very, very late. So perhaps this is naive, but I don't see really the problem. For me, as somebody who's working practically, politically with this concept, perhaps, it makes much more sense really to let the Anthropocene as to take this birth in the geological sphere, and if you take that up as a social scientist or as a philosopher, you can talk of the Anthropocene in some question marks or whatever, and say, well, I would call it capitalist system, or I would call it like this, but it is happening in the geological area of Anthropocene, and so far these two things are fitting together. And how can we work together now to explain the causes and to explain further effects other than only the in the rocks and in the air? Because this is also very necessary to talk about the other effects than only the geological ones of the Anthropocene. But I'm a little bit disappointed about to fight about this concept between, like Jürgen Wendt said, that this is a big problem. I don't see the big problem as somebody who is not perhaps so fixed in history or historical science and so fixed in geological stratospheric science. I can look a little bit from outside and see, well, it's an interesting concept which fits a lot of things together, so why not using the synergetic power in it?
So that's a brilliant and beautiful way to make peace between the stratigraphers and the historians, to emphasize that for stratigraphy it is visible effects, while historians may be preoccupied with causes that could go back chronologically well before. And as a first approximation, I think that's perfectly sensible. It gets a little untidy, probably, when you look more closely, because some of the effects manifest themselves before the middle of the 20th century. So you can see this in atmospheric chemistry, you can see it in some of the other things that the stratigraphers and geologists are pointing to. And you can also see that the driving forces that historians pay attention to, some of them have deep roots, some of them are pretty recent, and they're all, most of them actually, not all of them, ongoing. So they're still at work in the Anthropocene. They're not only deep roots, they're not only precedents, they are still in effect. So on close examination, I think the picture gets a little bit fuzzier. but as a first approximation, at a first glance, I think that's a reasonable way to reach a rapprochement between those two disciplines. So thank you.
I would very much agree, if I may, with this remark and your last exchange. And I think it's a hallmark of productive concepts that they're a little bit fuzzy, that they are open to controversial interpretations and discussions. And so I think this is very fruitful. And I agree also with your remark that they're building a bridge, in particular between the natural sciences, the political sphere, and the humanities and the social sciences. And that's hard to build. These bridges are hard to build. But when you say, you know, where's the big problem? I think you haven't seen the worst of it. And as far as I'm concerned, the worst of it is now in attempts to throw away this bridge, throw away the term, and replace it by concepts that are more palpable to the humanities, to talk about the Capitalocene. As much as I would agree that capitalism is one of the main driving forces of the Anthropocene, I would object to now throw away the concept of Anthropocene, which builds this bridge, replace it by Capitalocene, let alone Chtulocene. You know, who can remember that? You know,
who can pronounce it?
Me. I said, yes, you just heard. But that doesn't help anybody, because I think it's really very important to keep this space of the Anthropocene open, to have a firm, it's an ideal situation for this public discourse, because we have a firm anchoring point in the stratigraphic discourse, although it hasn't finished, as you have pointed out, and yet the openness of the discussion in the humanities and the political relevance.
Yeah, I too get very frustrated with Jason Moore and Donna Haraway, who are trying to toss out the term Anthropocene and replace it with something of their own coinage. And I think that only makes the intellectual labors harder. It may serve some purpose. I haven't recognized the purpose that it serves.
Yeah.
I have a question of clarification.
Gino, please, take the mic. I give it to you. Oh, you have.
Very small. It's just, did you have the Teufelsberg in your first slide?
Yes, I did.
Please.
Oh, so one of the things that I can't remember who, one member of the working group brought up was whether or not the Teufelsberg could serve as a golden spike, because it was created immediately after May of 1945, and it will be there as unconsolidated rock and rubble and concrete for millions of years. So its preservation potential is excellent. It meets that criterion. The reason this discussion didn't go any further is because it doesn't meet the globality criterion. And we discussed this, and this is actually a place where a historian was useful, because there are equivalents of Teufelsberg in many German cities, and there are equivalents of Teufelsberg in Japanese cities from exactly the same time period, but that's about it for Teufelsberg equivalents. So we dropped that, and then we went on to talk about metro systems, subways, which also are going to leave a signature, a geological signature for millions of years. And they're much more global. There are hundreds of them. We counted them up. But chronologically, they don't fit as well as the Teufelsberg, which is almost instantaneous. Whereas the metros, they began in the 1880s and 1890s, and some are still being built. So from some perspectives, that's not precise enough to serve. So that's why the Teufelsberg was there. And before I started shortening this presentation, I was going to end with this discussion, but I cut that out and then forgot to change the first slide. So thank you for asking about that.
I think that's a sign that we should conclude now. And I would like to thank you warmly very much again for this broad overview and the deep insights that you have shared with us. Thank you very much, Professor McNeill.